The flight attendants had barely finished greeting passengers when a sharp voice cut through the cabin. A woman with perfectly styled hair and oversized sunglasses sneered at a young woman walking toward her first-class seat. "People like you don't belong here," she said with cruel confidence, her words dripping with arrogance. The cabin grew tense as curious eyes darted toward the scene. The young woman, dressed simply in jeans and a light sweater, paused for a moment. She wasn't carrying designer luggage or flaunting wealth. She simply smiled politely and took a seat without responding. The woman in sunglasses scoffed loudly. Certain she had made her point, what no one in that cabin knew was that the young woman wasn't just another passenger. She was the daughter of a federal air marshal, one of the men sworn to protect the skies from hidden threats. And while she didn't flash her identity or status, she carried with her the same calm strength her father had drilled into her for years. The arrogant stranger had no idea who she had just insulted or how that choice would echo throughout the flight. The plane hummed beneath them as boarding continued, sunlight spilling warmly through the large cabin windows. People whispered, phones were slid out to record, and the arrogance of one entitled traveler began to unravel in real time. What started as a sneer about who belongs in first class was about to spiral into a lesson in respect, dignity, and power. By the time the wheels touched down on solid ground, the very woman who claimed authority through money and status would be left exposed in front of everyone, and the quiet passenger she had mocked. She would prove that true strength requires no announcement. The morning was bright and alive with energy at the airport. Sunlight spilled across the polished floors of the terminal, bouncing off luggage carts and large glass windows. People rushed from one gate to another, dragging carry-ons, clutching passports, balancing coffee cups that steamed in the golden light. It was one of those days where everything seemed to move in motion, each traveler caught up in their own world. Some were hurried, desperate to make their flights. Others walked with ease, enjoying the routine of travel as though it was second nature. Among the tide of passengers, Claire moved with quiet purpose. She wasn't dressed like the business travelers in their tailored suits, nor like the holidaymakers in loud shirts and sandals. Instead, she wore a light gray sweater, comfortable jeans, and simple white sneakers. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she carried a navy blue backpack on her shoulder along with a small rolling suitcase. Nothing about her screamed wealth or importance. To most people, she looked like any other young woman traveling alone. But beneath her calm expression lay the steady presence of someone raised with discipline and resilience. Claire's father was an air marshal, and though he had never flaunted his role, his lessons had shaped her deeply. He had taught her that the strongest people were often the ones who didn't announce their strength. Confidence doesn't have to shout, he had told her once. It shows in how you walk, how you look someone in the eye, and how you handle yourself when others try to shake you. Those words echoed softly in her mind as she handed her ticket to the gate agent and stepped down the jet bridge. The aircraft loomed ahead, gleaming white under the sunlight streaming through the windows. Flight attendants welcomed passengers with polite smiles as Claire boarded. She offered a warm smile in return and began moving down the narrow aisle. The first-class cabin was bathed in daylight pouring through wide windows, making the leather seats glimmer faintly. Some passengers were already seated, scrolling through phones or flipping through glossy magazines. Others were adjusting luggage in the overhead bins. The atmosphere was calm, filled with the quiet hum of boarding chatter and the distant thrum of jet engines warming outside. Claire moved toward her assigned seat in first class, rolling her small suitcase with ease. She didn't make eye contact with anyone, focusing only on finding her place. And that was when it happened. A sudden figure shifted into her path, a woman in a bright floral scarf and oversized sunglasses, blocking the aisle with a designer bag slung over one arm. Her perfume hung heavy in the air, a sharp artificial sweetness that clung to the space between them. She looked at Claire with raised eyebrows, lips twisted in disdain. "Excuse me," Claire said softly, her voice calm but clear enough to be heard. The woman didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head back slightly, as though weighing the audacity of the request. Then, with deliberate sharpness, she let her words slice through the air. "People like you don't belong in first class." It was said loudly, as if meant for everyone within earshot. A few passengers nearby lifted their heads, pausing in their quiet conversations to glance over. One man lowered his newspaper slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. A woman clutching a toddler shifted uncomfortably, pulling her child closer. Even a flight attendant, placing a tray of drinks near the galley, hesitated mid-motion, her eyes darting toward the exchange. For a brief second, Claire froze. The words hung there, cutting into her peace like an unexpected storm. She could feel the heat of eyes watching, waiting to see how she would respond. Her heart thudded against her ribs, but her face remained composed. Her father's voice rose in her memory. "Don't let someone else's arrogance control your reaction." So she inhaled deeply, let the air fill her lungs, and then smiled gently. "My seat is just ahead," she said quietly, as if she hadn't been insulted at all. She shifted slightly, waiting for the woman to step aside. The woman in the floral scarf scoffed loudly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. She made a show of sliding her bag aside, moving only enough to let Claire squeeze past. First class is for people who earn their place, she muttered, loud enough to be heard by the nearest rows. Not for whatever this is. Claire didn't respond. She simply rolled her suitcase forward, slid gracefully into her seat, and placed her bag neatly in the overhead bin. Her movements were calm, deliberate, but she could feel the tension lingering in the air like static before a storm. The woman's words had unsettled more than just her. They had cast a shadow over the peaceful rhythm of boarding. Conversations had lowered to whispers. A few passengers exchanged disapproving glances toward the woman, while others shook their heads as if to say, "Here we go again." The woman took her own seat a few rows behind, still muttering under her breath about standards and real travelers. She sipped her champagne, her sunglasses still perched on her nose, despite the bright daylight already streaming through the cabin. Every so often, she glanced at Claire, as though daring her to react. But Claire sat quietly, fastening her seatbelt and gazing out of the window. She let her eyes wander across the tarmac, watching the ground crew bustle below in fluorescent vests, guiding luggage carts and fueling trucks under the warm morning sun. She wasn't angry, not really. She had heard things like this before. Small remarks, sideways glances, assumptions made by strangers. Her father had told her that people often judged what they didn't understand, and while words could sting, they only carried the power one allowed them to. Still, Claire couldn't ignore the ripple effect. The insult hadn't just been aimed at her. It had touched everyone within hearing distance. The air inside the cabin felt heavier now, quieter, as though every passenger was aware of an invisible line that had just been drawn. The engines rumbled faintly as more passengers filed in. The steady rhythm of boarding resuming, Claire stayed silent, her face turned toward the daylight spilling through her window. She didn't need to defend herself to a stranger. Not here, not now. But something deep in her chest told her that this wasn't the end of it. The woman's arrogance was too loud, too determined to let the moment pass quietly. Claire could almost feel it, the sharp eyes behind the sunglasses still burning into her back, searching for another chance to strike. And so, in the calm of that bright morning cabin, a quiet tension took root, the kind of tension that grows, patient and waiting, ready to reveal itself when the skies above are no longer calm. The aircraft had settled into a steady rhythm as the last passengers boarded. Sunlight streamed through the oval windows, spilling across polished armrests and gleaming seat buckles. The hum of the engines pulsed beneath the cabin, low and steady, like a heartbeat waiting to quicken. Flight attendants moved with practiced grace, guiding latecomers to their seats, securing bags in overhead compartments, and offering practiced smiles that carried both warmth and authority. Claire sat quietly, her seatbelt already fastened, her posture calm. She stared out the window where the runway stretched like a long gray ribbon under the bright morning sky. Yet she could feel the weight of the earlier encounter pressing down on her. The woman in the floral scarf curtain, as Claire overheard another passenger whisper, wasn't finished. Every so often, Claire could hear the sharp clink of her champagne glass against its stem, followed by another comment, pitched just loud enough for people to hear. "I don't know why they let anyone in here these days," Karen muttered, her tone heavy with disdain. She tilted her head toward the man seated beside her, who shifted uncomfortably and offered only a polite nod. First class used to mean something. Standards are gone now. A man across the aisle, dressed in a navy business suit, lowered his phone and gave her a disapproving look. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered long enough for Karen to notice. She sniffed loudly and turned her face toward the window, hiding behind oversized sunglasses that reflected the bright light streaming in. Claire kept her silence, remembering her father's advice. Silence can be the strongest response. Yet, in the quiet cabin, Karen's arrogance rang louder than any argument could. Passengers who had initially dismissed the confrontation now found themselves quietly rooting for the young woman who had chosen dignity over drama. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, warm and steady, announcing the flight's duration and weather conditions in Miami. His words floated above the tension, offering momentary distraction. The flight attendants prepared the cabin for takeoff, checking seatbelts and reminding passengers to stow their electronics. Claire adjusted her seatbelt a little tighter, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She felt calm, but her awareness was sharp, honed by years of her father's training and observation. Every sound, every shift of movement in the cabin seemed amplified. When the plane finally rolled down the runway, Claire felt the familiar rush as it lifted smoothly into the sky. The sunlight grew brighter as the aircraft climbed above scattered clouds, the world below shrinking into a quilt of green and gray. The cabin tilted slightly, then leveled out, and the seatbelt light chimed off. A ripple of relief and comfort moved through the passengers, accompanied by the usual clicks of unbuckling belts and the soft rustle of magazines being opened. Karen wasted no time. She pressed her call button almost immediately, her movements exaggerated. When the flight attendant approached, Karen leaned back in her seat with an air of superiority. "I'll need another glass of champagne," she said, her tone dripping with entitlement. Then, with a slight tilt of her head toward Claire, she added, "And perhaps you should check if all passengers here actually belong in first class. Standards really should be maintained." The attendant, a woman with dark hair neatly pinned back, paused. Her eyes flickered briefly toward Claire, then back to Karen. Her professional smile didn't falter, but her voice held a quiet firmness. All passengers in this cabin are ticketed and belong exactly where they are. Ma'am, the response drew a few muffled chuckles from nearby passengers, though quickly disguised as coughs or rustling. Claire didn't look up, but she felt the support settling quietly around her. Karen's lips tightened, and she accepted her fresh glass of champagne without further comment. But the tension remained, coiling tighter with every word she had spoken. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engine soothe her. She wasn't angry, not yet. She had grown up understanding that arrogance was a mask people wore to hide their own insecurities. What unsettled her was not the insult itself, but the way it was delivered, as though Karen truly believed she had the authority to decide who was worthy of respect. Claire could almost hear her father's voice again. The loudest person in the room often has the least to say. Time passed slowly in the bright cabin. The attendants moved down the aisle with trays of drinks and small snacks. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixing with the faint scent of reheated bread rolls. Claire accepted a glass of water with a polite smile and returned to her window view. The clouds below looked like vast white mountains floating in a sea of blue. She thought about how her father used to point out the beauty of flying, even during long assignments. When you're up here, the world feels smaller, he had told her once. It reminds you that no problem is bigger than the sky. Her moment of peace was cut short when Karen's voice rose again. Sharper this time. You know, it's just wrong, she declared, speaking loudly enough for several rows to hear. First class should be for successful people, for those of us who've earned it, not for, well, you know. The man in the navy suit finally turned, his patience clearly thinning. Ma'am, he said calmly, everyone here paid for their seat. I think that makes us all equals in this cabin. Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off. She adjusted her sunglasses and sniffed again. Well, I suppose standards are subjective. Her voice had lost a touch of its sharpness, but the smugness still lingered. Claire felt a flicker of gratitude toward the businessman but stayed quiet. She didn't need to add fuel to the fire. She knew the cabin had already taken notice, and Karen's behavior was slowly turning the sympathy away from her and toward the young woman she had insulted. Silence, after all, had its own kind of power. As the plane glided smoothly above the clouds, Claire realized something else. Karen's arrogance wasn't simply about her. This was a performance, designed to draw attention, to remind everyone that Karen believed she was superior. But in trying so hard to prove her importance, she was only exposing her insecurity. The sunlight shifted slightly, warming Claire's arm through the window as the plane leveled higher into the bright sky. She adjusted her seat, leaned back, and allowed herself to relax despite the ongoing tension. She didn't know exactly how the rest of the flight would unfold, but something in her bones told her it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let go quietly, and Claire, though calm and collected, wasn't the type to break under pressure. The sky outside was endless, stretching in every direction, and the hum of the engines reminded her of the strength that lay hidden beneath the calm surface. Somewhere in the back of the cabin, she heard Karen mutter again, her voice dripping with irritation. But Claire didn't flinch. She let the sound wash over her like distant thunder. The storm was still building, and Claire knew, sooner or later, it would break. The plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, sunlight pouring through the wide windows like golden silk. From Claire's seat, the sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of pale blue and brilliant white, dotted with towering clouds that looked like castles floating in the air. The hum of the engines was steady, lulling many passengers into a quiet rhythm. Some scrolled through phones, others flipped through magazines, and a few leaned back with eyes closed, already drifting into mid-morning naps. But not everyone was at ease. Claire felt the tension still buzzing faintly in the air, a thread connecting the rows between her and the woman in the floral scarf. Karen had gone quiet for a few minutes, sipping her champagne and flipping through a glossy travel magazine as though she were above the drama she had created. Yet every so often she muttered something sharp under her breath, just loud enough for people nearby to hear. Words like cheap, ordinary, and out of place floated through the comm cabin, as though she needed to remind herself and everyone else of her supposed superiority. Claire sat back, steady and composed. She had chosen silence, and that silence was beginning to work against Karen. Other passengers noticed. A woman across the aisle gave Claire a supportive smile. The businessman in navy nodded slightly at her restraint. Even a flight attendant paused briefly to squeeze Claire's shoulder when passing with a tray, a silent acknowledgement of respect. Still, Karen's arrogance simmered, waiting for a chance to boil over. That chance came during meal service. The flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle, the smell of warm bread and seasoned chicken filling the cabin. As plates were set in front of passengers, Karen wrinkled her nose dramatically. "Is this really what they're serving in first class now?" she said loudly, eyeing the chicken with disdain. "I've had better meals in coach on European airlines." Her voice carried down the aisle, and heads turned again. She pointed a manicured finger toward Claire's tray. "See, they give her the same as me. What's the point of paying more if standards are this low?" This time, Claire looked up, Her eyes met Karen's across the rows. Calm but unwavering. She didn't say a word, but her gaze alone was enough to silence the cabin for a moment. The look wasn't defiant, nor was it submissive, it was steady, grounded, the kind of look that said, I see you, and I won't bend. Karen shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of that quiet confidence. She reached for her champagne glass again, taking a quick sip as though to cover her unease. But she wasn't finished. Halfway through the meal, a patch of turbulence shook the plane gently. The cabin lights flickered for a second, and passengers instinctively tightened their grips on trays and glasses. The shake was mild, nothing alarming, but it was enough to stir murmurs. A toddler whimpered in the back, soothed quickly by her mother. Claire remained calm, her fork steady in her hand, but Karen gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. This is unacceptable, she cried out, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. I knew this flight would be trouble the moment I saw who they were letting in first class. Standards slipping everywhere, you can feel it. Gasps rippled through the rows. Some passengers frowned in disbelief. Others exchanged exasperated glances. The businessman in navy spoke again, his voice sharper this time. Enough, ma'am. Stop blaming other people for turbulence. Karen ignored him, her eyes narrowing on Claire instead. It's bad luck, she hissed. People who don't belong bring chaos with them. I should have known. The words sliced through the air. Claire felt the sting, but only for a second. Then, just as quickly, calmness returned. She set down her fork, wiped her hands on her napkin, and turned fully toward Karen. Her voice, when it came, it was quiet but firm. You don't know me, she said simply. The words weren't shouted, but they carried. The cabin hushed, leaning in without meaning to. Karen blinked, taken aback by the clarity in Claire's tone. But before she could fire back, a movement at the front of the cabin drew attention. The door to the crew area opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wore plain clothes, dark trousers, and a crisp white shirt, but his presence was commanding. Broad-shouldered, steady, his eyes swept the cabin with sharp awareness. Passengers straightened in their seats, sensing immediately that this was no ordinary traveler. Claire's heart skipped. She knew that walk, that calm authority. Her father. He had been on the same flight, though not seated in first class. Federal air marshals rarely announced themselves, blending among passengers to observe quietly. But now, something had drawn him forward. He greeted a flight attendant with a nod, then scanned the cabin again. His eyes softened when they landed on Claire, just for a second, before hardening again as he noticed the tension. Karen, oblivious, leaned toward the man in navy and whispered loudly, finally, some authority around here. Maybe he'll put her in her place. The businessman's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The air marshal stepped closer, his voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Is everything all right here? The flight attendant answered quickly, her tone respectful. Just a passenger causing disruption. We've handled it, sir. Karen perked up, mistaking his authority for support. She pointed toward Claire with a smug smile. Yes, exactly. That girl, she doesn't belong here. She's been making this whole cabin uncomfortable since boarding. You should do something about her. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Claire remained still, her face serene, but inside her chest, her heart pounded. She didn't want to reveal who she was, not like this, but her father's presence meant the truth was no longer a secret waiting to stay hidden. The air marshal's gaze shifted to Karen, sharp and unyielding. That young woman, he said slowly, is my daughter. The words dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of shock through the cabin. Gasps erupted, followed by murmurs. Karen's mouth fell open, her face paling beneath the layers of makeup. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Her sunglasses slipped slightly down her nose, revealing wide, stunned eyes. Passengers leaned back in satisfaction, some exchanging knowing smiles. The businessman in navy let out a quiet chuckle. The woman across the aisle clapped her hands once, sharply, before covering her mouth to hide her grin. Even the flight attendants allowed themselves the faintest smiles. Claire lowered her gaze briefly, a small blush creeping into her cheeks. She hadn't wanted her identity tied to a father's role. She didn't want respect handed to her because of him. But in this moment, she realized something else. Karen's cruelty had needed this reckoning. Her father rested a steady hand on Claire's shoulder, his presence grounding her. She belongs here, he said firmly, his voice carrying through the cabin. Then, looking directly at Karen, he added, and respect is not optional on this flight. Karen sank into her seat, her bravado shattered. She reached for her champagne glass again, but her hand shook so visibly she set it back down without drinking. The cabin slowly returned to normal, but the balance had shifted. Where once Karen's arrogance had dominated the air, now it was Claire's quiet strength and her father's undeniable authority that filled the space. And for the first time since takeoff, Claire allowed herself to breathe freely. The storm had broken, but the lesson for Karen was only just beginning. The cabin had gone completely silent after the air marshal's words. Even the steady hum of the engines seemed muted, swallowed by the weight of what had just been revealed. Claire sat perfectly still, her father's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, anchoring her in the middle of the storm. Around them, passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers fluttering like restless birds. Karen sat frozen in her seat, her lips parted, her face pale beneath the heavy powder of makeup. The smug smile she had worn for most of the flight was gone, replaced by an expression of disbelief and dawning humiliation. For the first time since boarding, she seemed uncertain of herself, stripped of the false authority she had clung to. Her hand fumbled for the champagne glass again, but when she lifted it, the liquid inside trembled as visibly as her fingers. She set it down quickly, pretending she had no desire to drink. The businessman in navy leaned back in his seat with quiet satisfaction, crossing his arms. The woman across the aisle, who had smiled at Claire earlier, whispered to her husband, "Well, that explains her composure." Her voice carried just enough for Karen to hear. Karen's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. The flight attendant who had been handling Karen's demands earlier stepped closer to the air marshal. "Thank you, sir," she said respectfully. "We'll keep the cabin calm from here." Her eyes lingered on Karen for a moment, her expression polite but firm, before she turned to check on another row. Claire exhaled slowly, finally allowing herself to relax into her seat. She had not wanted her father to intervene. She had been ready to endure the rest of the flight in silence, but now that he had, the balance in the cabin felt different. The quiet support of strangers had transformed into open solidarity. Karen's power was gone, her arrogance exposed under the weight of daylight truth. For several minutes, nothing happened. The plane sailed smoothly through the bright sky, sunlight reflecting off the wing outside Claire's window. Passengers returned to their meals and magazines. Though the energy in the room was still charged, it felt like everyone was waiting to see what Karen would do next. Karen adjusted her floral scarf, tugging at it nervously as though it could hide her. She leaned toward the businessman beside her, lowering her voice, but not enough to escape notice. "I didn't know," she whispered hoarsely. "How was I supposed to know?" The businessman's eyes didn't leave his book. "You didn't need to know," he replied flatly. "Respect shouldn't depend on who someone is." Karen flinched as though struck. She sank back into her seat, her sunglasses now resting crookedly on her nose. The glamour she had tried to display earlier seemed to crumble under the weight of every passing second. Claire's father gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. He didn't return to coach immediately. Instead, he stayed near the galley, keeping a discreet eye on the cabin. His presence was calm, quiet, but undeniably authoritative. Everyone knew now that he was there, watching, and no one dared disturb the fragile peace. Claire sipped her water, her gaze fixed out the window. She felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. She had never wanted a confrontation. She had only wanted peace. Yet, she couldn't deny a sense of justice in seeing Karen forced into silence. It wasn't revenge. What wasn't revenge, it was balance restored. But Karen, despite her humiliation, couldn't completely let go of her pride. After a long stretch of silence, she leaned forward again, her voice sharper though quieter than before. "I didn't mean anything personal," she muttered toward Claire. "It's just, first class is supposed to have standards. I was only saying what others were thinking." Claire turned her head, meeting Karen's eyes directly for the first time since her father's reveal. Her voice was steady, low but clear. No one else was thinking that. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Karen blinked, her mouth opening, but no defense came. She looked around, perhaps searching for support, but found none. Every pair of eyes that met hers carried disapproval or disappointment. Even the flight attendants, moving gracefully down the aisle, kept their distance with cool professionalism. The businessman in navy chuckled softly, though not unkindly. "Sometimes silence says more than words, ma'am," he said, echoing the lesson Claire had been living all along. Karen sank deeper into her seat, her sunglasses slipping further until she yanked them off entirely and shoved them into a bag. Without them, her eyes looked smaller, more vulnerable. She turned toward the window, but the sunlight streaming in offered no shield. The hours stretched on. The cabin settled back into routine, the clink of cutlery, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional laughter from a distant row. Yet beneath it all lingered the memory of the earlier clash. Passengers stole glances at Claire, some offering subtle nods of respect. Claire acknowledged them with a small smile but didn't engage further. She had no desire to make herself the center of attention. Instead, she thought of her father. He stood a few rows ahead, speaking quietly with a flight attendant, his presence steady as ever. She felt a warmth in her chest, a reminder of all the times he had told her that dignity was a choice, not a reaction. She realized now how much that truth had carried her through this flight. Garin remained quiet for the rest of the service. She ate little, pushing food around her plate, and ordered no more champagne. Every so often, she glanced toward Claire, her expression caught between resentment and shame, but she didn't speak again. Perhaps she had finally understood that the louder she was, the smaller she appeared. When the trays were cleared and the cabin lights dimmed slightly for rest, Claire leaned back, closing her eyes. The steady hum of the engines wrapped around her, soothing in its constancy. She thought about the strange way the morning had unfolded, how a simple insult had grown into a storm that touched everyone in the cabin. And yet, as the storm calmed, she felt stronger, more certain of herself. The flight stretched onward, clouds rolling beneath them like endless waves of white. Daylight filled the cabin, warm and soft, as though reminding everyone that above the clouds, the sky was always clear. Claire drifted between wakefulness and rest, her father's presence still grounding her, his steady watch reminding her she was never truly alone. Behind her, Karen sat stiffly, her once commanding posture slumped into something smaller. She had wanted the cabin's attention, but now she wished only to disappear into anonymity. For the first time, she seemed aware of how words could trap a person as much as free them. The lesson lingered in the air. Respect is not granted by wealth, nor earned by arrogance. It exists in silence, in kindness, in the way strangers notice when someone chooses dignity over pride. And though no one said it aloud, everyone in that first-class cabin knew Claire belonged exactly where she was. The hours passed, and the flight began its slow descent through the bright morning sky. The sunlight, once sharp and dazzling above the clouds, now softened as the plane lowered toward the world below. The blue stretched endlessly beyond the windows, dotted with drifting clouds that glowed golden in the late morning light. The captain's calm voice announced their arrival into Miami, promising clear skies and smooth weather ahead. Claire adjusted her seat, fastening her belt as instructed. Around her, passengers stirred awake, stretching and gathering their belongings. There was the usual hum of energy before landing luggage being shifted, hushed conversations about connections, the rustle of magazines being tucked away. Yet underneath the ordinary sounds lingered the memory of what had unfolded during the flight. No one had forgotten, even if most pretended to return to routine. Karen sat quietly a few rows back, her once grand posture deflated. The floral scarf that had seemed so proud earlier now looked rumpled, and her sunglasses remained shoved in her bag. Her face was pale, lips pressed tightly together, eyes downcast. She hadn't spoken since her last attempt to justify herself hours before. Now, she seemed determined to vanish into silence, though her discomfort was written plainly across her face. Passengers continued to glance her way, some openly, others with subtle side eyes. The businessman in navy leaned forward as he gathered his briefcase, his expression calm but firm, as if he still wanted to remind her of her place. The woman across the aisle whispered something to her husband and shook her head, her eyes softening when they landed on Claire instead. It was clear to everyone who had earned respect on this flight and who had lost it. Claire, however, didn't bask in the attention. She kept her gaze on the view outside her window, where the coastline slowly emerged in the distance. The shimmering water reflected the sunlight, waves crashing faintly against the shore. It was beautiful, peaceful, grounding. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself. Her father, still stationed near the front of the cabin, caught her eye briefly. He gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to remind her of everything he had taught her. She wasn't defined by insults, or by the need to fight back loudly. She was defined by her composure, by her choice to rise above the wheels touched down with a soft jolt, followed by the familiar screech of rubber against runway. A wave of relief passed through the cabin as passengers clapped lightly, some out of habit, others out of genuine appreciation for the smooth landing. The engines roared, then slowed, as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. As soon as the seatbelt light switched off, the familiar scramble began. Overhead bins opened, bags were pulled down, coats were shrugged on. But there was a difference in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the usual rush to leave, it was the quiet acknowledgement of a story shared, a memory made in the bright daylight of the skies. Karen stood to, clutching her designer bag against her chest. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The arrogance that had once fueled her words had vanished, replaced by shame that weighed heavily on her shoulders. For perhaps the first time in her life, she seemed aware that money and status could not shield her from truth. As Claire rose to gather her own belongings, an older man from a nearby row spoke up softly. "You handled yourself with grace, young lady," he said. His voice carried warmth, admiration. Not everyone could have done that. Claire smiled politely, nodding in thanks. She didn't need to say more. The look in his eyes told her he understood exactly what her silence had meant. One by one, passengers filed down the narrow aisle toward the exit. Claire stepped aside to help an elderly woman reach her bag, steadying it as it slid from the bin. Small acts of kindness had always come naturally to her, instilled by her father's lessons. True strength, she knew, wasn't about putting others down, it was about lifting them up when it was her turn to move forward. She felt Karen shift behind her, trying to keep distance. The once arrogant woman had shrunk into herself, walking carefully, her chin lowered. No one said anything to her, but the silence was louder than words. Respect, once lost, doesn't return easily. At the cabin door, sunlight streamed through the jet bridge, washing the entrance in bright gold. Claire's father stood nearby, speaking briefly with the flight attendants. They nodded respectfully at him, clearly grateful for his presence during the flight. When he turned toward Claire, his eyes softened again, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with pride. Claire smiled, her heart swelling at the words. She didn't need more, those 3 words were everything. Together, they stepped off the plane, the sunlight warming their faces as they entered the bustling terminal. Behind them, Karen followed, swallowed by the crowd, her presence no longer commanding. No one would remember her as the glamorous woman in the floral scarf. They would remember her as the passenger who had been silenced by her own arrogance. But they would remember her differently, as the girl who stayed calm when insulted, the one who carried herself with dignity in the face of cruelty, the daughter of the air marshal. Yes, but more importantly, the young woman who had proven that respect isn't demanded with noise, but earned through quiet strength. The story of that flight would live in whispers, in conversations replayed at dinner tables and on phone calls to family. You wouldn't believe what happened on my flight today, people would say, and at the center of it, always, was Claire, the quiet storm that had changed everything, terminal with her father by her side. Claire knew one thing with absolute certainty: she belonged, not just in first class, not just in the skies. She belonged anywhere she chose to stand, because her strength wasn't borrowed from wealth or title, it was her own. And Karen, whether she admitted it or not, would never forget the lesson.